Okay, so this is the first episode talking about Nightfall at Old Tucson Studios, or to be more exact, Ghost Town Nights at Old Tucson Studios. As you can see in the poster, it was originally called Ghost Town Nights. At that point in time, Old Tucson Studios was open from 10 in the morning to maybe like 10 at night. So they had daytime shows and they had nighttime shows. The initial idea for Ghost Town Nights was for October. The nighttime shows would be Halloween-based type shows. So the ideas for Ghost Town Nights were basically given to Jonathan Minks, and Jonathan Minks created all these characters. He introduced the idea of the Goulliard Asylum, which I believe is based off of a Goulliard Asylum arch that used to be part of Mexican Plaza. He created Dr. Jebediah Hyde, who was the caretaker of the asylum, basically the person who was under complete control of the asylum. He was introduced during this year in this little shack that was part of Mexican Plaza, which was this like apothecary kind of thing. Supposedly reading a book on spiritualism, and every once in a while when people came around, he slammed the book and began to talk to guests and stuff like that. And I believe in a random act of time, they would do these bloodletting operations on inmates and stuff. Other characters that were introduced were Marietta, who was more synonymous with the movie guillotine that they had, cutting off heads. It wasn't a real guillotine, it was a movie guillotine. Marietta was like this jilted bride character, and she was synonymous with it. Another character that would be introduced would evolve into this character called Crazy Sam. And Crazy Sam was introduced at the front gate, tied to a chair, dropped off at the depot at the front of the gate. Basically, he'd act really crazy tied to that chair for guests. But mainly what Ghost Town Nights was basically a night where all these crazy inmate type people would run amok. I believe they had haunted walks for that year. It was called the Goulliard Rehabilitation Center, and it was held inside High Chaparral set, which still exists today. It wasn't too much based off of the story quite yet. According to Michael Solomonson, who was working at Old Tucson Studios at the time in the mid-90s, he says that the initial story, the first story, was indeed played the very first year. So I'm going to go ahead and go with that idea. So the first story is called The Gothic West. It introduced this idea of this Gothic Western town with the Goulliard Asylum, and Dr. Jebediah Hyde and the inmates basically are part of this community. So it starts off with this inmate having a feud with this werewolf, and the Sheriff Clampett, ends up gunning down the creature, but it doesn't quite work. And a guard comes in, Kavanaugh, and he starts firing at the werewolf, and that doesn't work. And then eventually Hyde comes in with his experiment called Mulgar, who was initially the original sheriff of the town. He takes out the werewolf with a silver bullet. So once the werewolf is taken care of, Marietta supposedly escapes from her cell, and she's out, and she's still talking about the death of her husband and the wedding and stuff like that. She's having to be dealt with. And it feels like all the inmates are getting out and nothing's being organized. And so Hyde kind of yells at Clampett, and so he orders him to get the inmate, which I believe was the Sam character from the depot, for the experiment that involves the werewolf. And this inmate is going to be decapitated for the experiment. Clampett seems a bit uneasy with the situation, but he decides to go ahead and take care of business. At that point in time, we are introduced to the protagonist, Josie McFarland, a Civil War Confederate type character who knows about Dr. Jebediah Hyde torturing some of the Civil War soldiers during the war. At least that's the initial idea, I believe. Hyde basically blows it off as Josie just being criminally insane, and this just being another episode. And he realizes that these outbursts of Josie's, if these episodes continue, he will become a threat to the community. He decides that if electrotherapy doesn't cure him from his outbursts, then he is too much of a risk. So he decides that he will be used to be part of the werewolf experiment. So his head is going to be cut off. So the sheriff and some of the inmates begin to believe if Josie is killed, then they will be next. And that what Dr. Jebediah Hyde is doing in this experiment is outlandish and must be stopped. So Marietta goes up to the podium with the guillotine, and the sheriff and Duncan grab a figure with Hyde's hat and Hyde's cloak on. They take him to the guillotine, and they chop off his head. They take the head from the basket, lift it up, and it's Josie McFarland. And then Hyde basically explains that he's the only outlet for Josie McFarland now, and that the inmates need to do everything that he says. So that's basically Ghost Town Nights at Old Tucson Studios. Because of this poster, the name Nightfall just stuck. So, next installment, we're going to talk about Beware of Nightfall 2.